Tag TV US-Canada brings you news and views from White House and State Department's press briefings. Sarah Sanders, White House Press Secretary. Heather Neward, the spokesperson for the U.S. Department of State. Nikki Haley, U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations.
Hi, everybody. Hi, Nazira. Nice to see you. Hi, everyone. How are you today? I'd like to start out with a couple toppers to provide you. The first one, it's the first time that we've been together since that horrific attack took place in Afghanistan just a few days ago. So I'd like to start out addressing that today. The United States strongly condemns the attack on January 20th at the Intercontinental Hotel in Kabul. Violence like this has no place in Afghanistan or anywhere else in the world. We offer our deepest condolences to the families and friends of those who were killed and wish a speedy recovery to those who were wounded, including multiple U.S. citizens who were among the casualties. The protection of U.S. citizens is our highest priority. We've been providing assistance and notifying family members following that attack. The United States stands with the government and the people of Afghanistan and remain firmly committed to supporting our Afghan efforts to achieve peace, security, and prosperity for their country. In addition to that, I'd like to mention some travel that has taken place. Our USAID administrator, many of you have met Mark Green, former ambassador and former member of Congress. He visited Syria yesterday, along with General Joe Votel, the commander of U.S. Central Command. Administrator Green is the senior-most civilian official to have visited Syria since the crisis began. That's significant. Remember, just a few months ago, Raqqa was still under ISIS control, and now with the city liberated, we have State Department and USAID officials on the ground in northern Syria, working alongside our Department of Defense colleagues to help people return home and get them back on their feet. Administrator Green met with members of the teams and saw projects in the area that are helping to restore essential services for the people of Raqqa. Administrator Green also visited a camp for displaced persons, many of whom fled ISIS. The United States has now provided more than $875 million in non-lethal stabilization and humanitarian assistance to the Syrian people since the start of the crisis in 2011. As people return home to places like Raqqa and reopen shops and schools, we are starting to see real hope. That's one of the things that Administrator Green had spoken to me about earlier today. We spoke by phone as he's actually on his way to Davos, where he will be talking with international partners about the humanitarian situation there. And he said as he looked around and saw just such extreme devastation and rubble everywhere, he also saw some glimmers of hope. He would see a woman in a very dusty doorstep, because there's so much rubble around, sweeping that doorstep. Imagine that, amid all the ruins, sweeping a doorstep, because he tells me she was on the verge of starting a business. So you look at that and you see that there's hope there and resilience certainly in the Syrian people. I look forward to reintroducing you all to Administrator Green when he comes back to the United States for hopefully a readout on that trip. And then lastly, I'd like to talk a little bit about the Secretary's travel in Europe. And provide you with a quick update on that. He was in London yesterday, where he met with Prime Minister May, Foreign Secretary Johnson, and Britain's National Security Advisor. I'm sure you saw his remarks as he spoke with Foreign Secretary Johnson. The Secretary reinforced the importance of our special relationship with the UK and continued to discuss ways to address flaws in the JCPOA, as well as other issues of mutual concern, including Syria, Libya, the DPRK, and also Ukraine. Today, Secretary Tillerson is in Paris. He met with a foreign minister there and then attended a launch of an international partnership against impunity for the use of chemical weapons. At the conclusion of that chemical weapons event, Secretary Tillerson had the chance to speak with some press about an issue that I know is important to all of us. I'm sure you've seen the remarks by now about chemical weapons, but I'd like to just take a moment to reiterate some of the things that the Secretary had to say. The recent attacks in East Ghouta in Syria raise serious concerns that Bashar al-Assad's Syrian regime may be continuing its use of chemical weapons against its own people. Whoever conducted those attacks, Russia, ultimately bears responsibility for the victims in East Ghouta and countless other Syrians targeted with chemical weapons since Russia became involved in Syria. There is simply no denying that Russia, by shielding its Syrian ally, has breached its commitment to the United States as framework guarantor. It has betrayed the Chemical Weapons Convention and UN Security Council Resolution 2118 and 3 times it has vetoed UN Security Council resolutions to enforce the Joint Investigative Mechanism and continue the JIM's mandate. Russia's failure to resolve chemical weapons issue in Syria calls into crisis its relevance to the resolution to stop the overall crisis. At a bare minimum, Russia must stop vetoing and at least abstain from future Security Council votes on this issue. We call on the community of responsible and civilized nations to put the use of chemical weapons to an end. In the afternoon, the Secretary will meet with a small group of chiefs of mission in Western Europe and discuss U.S. policy priorities in the region. He will also round out the day by attending a ministerial meeting on Syria and equality.
Good afternoon. The President, a couple of updates here before we get started. The President has been briefed on the shooting at Marshall County High School in Kentucky. Our thoughts and prayers are with the victims and families there, and we offer our sincerest appreciation to the heroic Marshall County deputy who apprehended the shooter. A few more updates before we bring up a couple of special guests. I'd like to leave no doubt where the White House stands on the Flake, Graham, and Durbin Agreement on immigration reform. In the bipartisan meeting here at the White House 2 weeks ago, we outlined a path forward on 4 issues: serious border security, an end to chain migration, the cancellation of the outdated and unsafe visa lottery, and a permanent solution to DACA. Unfortunately, the Flake-Graham-Durbin Agreement does not meet these benchmarks. In fact, it would not secure our border, encourage more illegal immigration, increase chain migration, and retain the visa lottery system. In short, it's totally unacceptable to the President and should be declared dead on arrival. The President has been extraordinarily consistent on the immigration and what his priorities are. His views are shared by the vast majority of the American people and have bipartisan support in the U.S. Senate and the House of Representatives. Moving along, we have some incredible economic news to share today. J.P. Morgan Chase announced this morning that because of the Trump tax cuts, they will raise wages for 22,000 of their employees, create thousands of new jobs, and increase small business by lending $4 billion. In total, these moves are part of a $20 billion investment plan for which J.P. Morgan Chase directly credits the passage of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, as well as the President's historic efforts to rolling back job-killing regulations. Also, Disney announced that over 125,000 employees will receive a $1,000 cash bonus, and the company is investing $50 million into a new employee education program. Lastly, Verizon announced today that all of their employees, other than the top management, will receive 50 shares of restricted stock. This amounts to about $2,500 per employee. Employees will further share in the company's success, Verizon said in a release. We're only 1 year in, and the President is just getting started. But we're pleased to see that our great American workers and families are already feeling the positive effects of the President's policies. As you know, the President will be traveling to the World Economic Forum later this week, so I brought in a couple of special guests to preview that trip. NEC Director Gary Cohn, who played a major role in the tax reform effort, and National Security Advisor General H.R. McMaster will discuss the trip and answer questions specific to that topic, and then I will be up with more information and to take your questions. Thanks. General.
I'm not general. I might be general.
In general.
In general, thank you very much.
And I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. Russia has convened us with almost no notice and then put forth a proposal that they hope will distract from a new French initiative to hold accountable those who use chemical weapons. Today, Russia is yet doing what it does best when it comes to chemical weapons. Russia is running from the facts. Russia has the audacity to lecture this Security Council about how to stop the use of chemical weapons. I know I've said this before, but it's worth repeating. In the past year, Russia used its veto 3 times to kill the Joint Investigative Mechanism in Syria. Russia, all on its own, killed the mechanism we had specifically tasked to identify those responsible for using chemical weapons in Syria. Russia should look in the mirror before bringing us into the Security Council to talk about chemical weapons. Earlier this week, we received yet another report that the Assad regime has used chlorine gas against its own people. dozens of civilians had to be treated for suffocation. Syrian children were literally gasping for breath as chlorine gas surrounded them. Of course, it's no coincidence that this week's chlorine gas attack reportedly happened in the exact place the Assad regime is trying to take over militarily. We know the Assad regime resorts to these brutal tactics when they want to retake territory without any regard for innocent civilians. And we know that for years, Russia has looked the other way while their Syrian friends use these despicable weapons of war. Russia is complicit in the Assad regime's atrocities. Will the Russian Federation say anything at all today about the suffering caused by Assad's barbaric tactics? Will they hold Assad to account? Of course not. They never do. So it's fitting Russia brought us here the same day that a new initiative on chemical weapons accountability was introduced in Paris. Today, France launched the International Partnership Against Impunity for Chemical Weapons. We strongly support this effort, and we commend France for their leadership. More than 25 like-minded countries have come together to share information on who used chemical weapons and to preserve that information to make sure that perpetrators will be held accountable. Make no mistake, the United States will continue to pursue, along with this Council, those who have used chemical weapons to ensure that they are held accountable for their atrocities. Russia says they have concerns with this French initiative to share evidence of chemical weapons use. That is no surprise. Russia opposed the joint investigative mechanism because it collected facts about who used chemical weapons in Syria. Now, Russia questions this French effort to collect facts on who used chemical weapons. What can we conclude? Simply put, when Russia doesn't like the facts, they try and distract the conversation. That's because the facts come back over and over again to the truth Russia wants to hide, that the Assad regime continues to use chemical weapons against its own people. Once again, Russia today threw around lots of different accusations. Again, that's not surprising. Russia often puts out misleading and unfounded claims to confuse the conversation about chemical weapons. In fact, this happens so often that we recently wrote to the Security Council with a detailed assessment of Russia's misleading claims. The letter is public and available for anyone to see. We encourage everyone to take a look at it for yourselves. Here's the bottom line. The Security Council gave the Joint Investigative Mechanism a mandate to tell us who used chemical weapons in Syria. When investigators found ISIS to be responsible, Russia was fine. When the investigators found that the Assad regime used them, Russia tried to find any excuse to poke holes in the investigation and threw up smoke to question the findings. But that is not how independent investigations work. You don't get to question the findings when they don't go your way. So we're not going to accept any Russian proposal that undermines our ability to get to the truth, or that politicizes what must be an independent and impartial investigation. If they want to work in good faith toward that goal, we are ready to reestablish the JIM with its original independent and impartial mandate right now. But anything less is unacceptable. To be crystal clear, the United States supports accountability for anyone who uses chemical weapons. We agree with Russia that ISIS must be held accountable for their use of these weapons, as the Joint Investigative Mechanism has found. But the difference between the United States and Russia is that we believe no one should be let off the hook. Chemical weapons must never be used. So Russia can continue to talk for as long as they want about chemical weapons. They can bring this up in the Security Council chamber as often as they want. We welcome the debate. The United States and the international community are not going to be fooled. We remain steadfast in pursuing accountability for those who use chemical weapons. We stand strong in doing all that we can to preserve the norm against their use. And we remain forever committed to preserving the truth of what the Assad regime has done in Syria, and sadly, what they will likely continue to do. Thank you.
I thank Representative of the United States for her statement.
Tag TV US-Canada brings you news and views from White House and State Department's press briefings. Sarah Sanders, White House Press Secretary. Heather Neward, the spokesperson for the U.S. Department of State. Nikki Haley, U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations.